The sheriff's twin sons pointed at the stranger and said, "Daddy, that's our new mama." The boots were the first thing I noticed about her. Not because they were pretty, they weren't. They were scuffed down to pale leather at the heel. Left one had a crack along the welt that someone had stitched closed with what looked like fence wire. She was standing on the platform at Colton Station with a canvas bag over one shoulder and nothing else, and she was looking at the mountains like she was trying to remember whether she'd been there before or was trying to decide if she wanted to be. The train had just pulled out. She hadn't gotten back on it. I had the boys with me that morning because Hilda Marsh, who watched them Tuesday through Friday, had taken sick, and I'd run out of people to ask. Caleb was up on the luggage cart spinning the wheels, and Ellis was sitting on the platform boards, eating something he'd found in his pocket that I'd decided not to look at too close. I was there to pick up a prisoner transfer that hadn't come. The wire had said Tuesday, but there was no prisoner and no follow-up. And that was the third time that particular deputy marshal out of Tucson had left me standing somewhere waiting on a man who didn't show. I was writing a note in my head about what I was going to say to him. Then Ellis said, "Daddy." I said, "Not now." He said, "Daddy," again, that particular way that meant it wasn't going to stop. I looked up. He was pointing at the woman on the platform. So was Caleb now. He'd stopped spinning the wheel and was standing on the cart pointing with both arms like he was calling a direction. They were 7, the boys. They pointed at things. Birds, dogs, strangers, clouds that looked like animals. I was used to it. But Ellis said, "Daddy, that's our new mama." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. The woman had heard it. She was only 30 feet away, and she had turned her head slightly but wasn't looking at us. She had dark hair, most of it pinned up and some of it not, and a jaw that looked like it had been set against something and hadn't unclenched all the way. I said, "Ellis, come down off that cart." He came down. Caleb climbed down too. They stood next to me, and for a moment all 3 of us were looking at the woman on the platform, which was embarrassing enough that I made myself look at my boots instead. She walked over. I should say, people didn't just walk over in Colton. You kept your distance until you were introduced or had business. She walked over anyway, and she looked at me with gray eyes that were doing a kind of arithmetic I couldn't follow, and she said, "Are these your boys?" I said they were. She looked at them. She didn't do what people often did, didn't crouch down to seem smaller, didn't talk in a higher register, didn't make that particular face adults make around children when they want the children to like them. She just looked at them steady, the way you'd look at a person. Caleb stared back at her. Ellis had gone suddenly shy, which was not a state he visited often, and was standing partly behind my leg. She said to Ellis, "What made you say that?" Ellis pressed his face against my thigh and said something I couldn't make out. She waited. She was patient was the thing. She didn't press it. She waited, and after a moment Ellis peeled himself off my leg and said, "You looked like you were staying." The woman thought about that for a second. Then she nodded, once like he'd said something that made sense. "I might be," she said. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She didn't offer more than that until she had to, and she didn't have to for almost a week. She'd come into the station house the morning after the platform, wanting to know if there was work anywhere in Colton. I had told her to try the Garfield Hotel, which was shorthanded since one of their kitchen girls had married and left in the spring. She went over, spoke to Mrs. Garfield, and was working that same afternoon. I know because I walked past the alley behind the hotel and heard her back there with a mop and a bucket, and what sounded like a one-sided argument she was having with a stubborn drain. I didn't introduce myself that time. I was a coward about it. I kept walking. I should say something about what things were like then, so you understand what I mean when I say I was a coward, and what kind. My wife Caroline had died 22 months before, fever. 3 days between sick and gone, and it had the particular cruelty of being fast and still too slow to get used to. I had the boys, who were 5 then, and I had the job, and I had a house that still smelled like her in certain rooms if the windows had been shut. I kept the job and the house and the boys. I got up every day. I fed them and brought them to school and did the work the county paid me to do and came home and made something for supper and put them to bed and then sat in the kitchen for an hour before I could sleep. 2 years of that, more or less. People had tried. There was a widow in town, Mrs. Pollard, who had cooked a remarkable number of meals and left them on my porch, and I'd eaten them and been grateful and felt nothing. My deputy Ames had invited me to his sister's birthday with a particular expression on his face that told me the sister was who I was supposed to be noticing. She was a fine woman. I couldn't hold a conversation with her that went past a certain point. I'd stopped being able to feel the opening that other people seemed to find in each other, the door that let someone in. Mine had rusted shut, I thought, or maybe I thought I was doing all right without it. You tell yourself things. So, a woman on the platform, boots stitched with fence wire, looking at the mountains, my boys pointing. I went back to work. 3 days later, I had cause to visit the Garfield Hotel on business. There'd been a disturbance involving 2 men from out of town and a card game that became something other than a card game. And Ruth Calloway was in the lobby when I came through the front door, carrying a stack of folded tablecloths taller than her head. She walked past me into the dining room and then came back without the tablecloths and said, "Did you need something from Mrs. Garfield or from the hotel generally?" It wasn't really a question, the way she said it. It was just a way of being useful. I said from Mrs. Garfield, and she told me Mrs. Garfield was in the back. And then she went back to her work and I went to see Mrs. Garfield, and that was that. Except that on the way out I passed through the dining room again, and Ruth Calloway was snapping tablecloths out over the tables with a clean, practiced motion. And she was humming something I didn't know the name of, and I stood there for 2 seconds longer than I needed to before I walked out. I mention it because it was the first time in a long time I'd stood still for no reason. The boys were asking about her. Not constantly, they weren't relentless about it, which I'd almost have preferred, because then I could have addressed it directly and put it to bed. Instead, they'd bring her up sideways. Ellis would say at supper, "Do you think that lady at the hotel is from Texas?" And I'd say I didn't know, and he'd nod and eat his beans. Caleb would ask what fence wire was, whether it was the same wire they used for the garden fence. I'd say roughly, and he'd nod, apparently satisfied. I knew what they were doing. 7-year-olds aren't subtle, but they're not stupid either. They were taking measurements, checking to see if I'd flinch. I took them past the hotel on a Saturday when I had no real reason to go that direction. I want to be honest about that. The route I usually walked was along Front Street and then past the land office and the barber. I went down Garfield Alley on a Saturday morning in October with 2 boys and no reason. We didn't see her. The back door of the hotel was shut and the alley was empty. We bought candy at Morrison's. We went home. The first time I spoke to her at length was because of the horse. There was a black mare tied in front of the assay office on a Monday morning, and she was in bad shape, ribs showing, a rope burn on her neck, poorly shod. I asked around and nobody claimed her, and after 2 days of that, I'd taken her to the livery and was planning to run a notice in the weekly. She was touch-shy and wouldn't let the livery boy near her, and he was close to refusing the boarding fee, which I couldn't afford to let happen. I was in there with her on a Wednesday evening, just standing at the stall door, not approaching, letting her look at me, when Ruth Calloway came through the livery doors. She'd apparently been helping Mrs. Garfield with a mare that had colicked the previous week. That was how she'd met Dorsey, who ran the livery, and that was why she had cause to be there. She didn't explain this to me then. I found it out later. She saw me at the stall. She saw the mare. She walked over without speaking, stood beside me and looked at the horse for a while. She said, "How long has she been here?" I said 3 days. She said she's working on deciding if you're safe. You been in there yet? I said no. She said, "Good, don't go in yet." She came back the next evening, and the evening after. I don't know how many evenings she came on her own when I wasn't there. I suspect several, from the way the mare was beginning to settle. On the fourth evening I was there when she arrived, and she went in, and the horse let her. I watched through the slats. She moved slowly and she didn't make unnecessary sounds, and when the mare put her nose against Ruth's shoulder, Ruth just stood and let it happen. I said without thinking, Caroline would have known how to do that. She didn't ask who Caroline was. She said after a moment, "Your wife." I said yes. She nodded slowly. She was still letting the mare read her shoulder. She said, "The boys don't talk about her." I said they'd been 5 when she died. They had some memories, good ones, I made sure of that, but they'd been 5. She said, "They talk about you, though." I looked at her. She said to me, "When they come by the hotel after school sometimes. They tell me things." I hadn't known the boys were going by the hotel. I felt something complicated about that. Part of it was that I should have known, and part of it was that I was glad, which made me feel like I'd stepped somewhere I hadn't meant to step. She said, "Caleb told me you fixed their shoes yourself because you haven't found a cobbler you trust since Mr. Hadley died. Ellis told me you always let them pick what's for supper on their birthdays, and last time Caleb picked beefsteak and Ellis picked apple pie, so you made both, and Ellis fell asleep before the pie." I didn't say anything. She came out of the stall and latched it. She looked at me, that steady arithmetic. She said, "They love you something fierce, those boys, you know that." I said I knew. She said, "Good. Some men don't know." She walked past me, out of the livery, and I stood there in the smell of hay and horse for longer than I should have, trying to locate where I'd put the part of myself that knew how to respond to something like that. She'd been in Colton about 5 weeks when I found out she was running from something. I want to be clear that I didn't find it out by prying. Ames found it out, which is different. He came to me one morning with a week-old newspaper out of Yuma with a short item in it. A woman wanted for questioning in connection with a shooting in a town called Gila Bend. The name in the paper was Ruth Galloway, spelled wrong. The description was approximate but not wrong. I sat with the paper for a long time. Then I went to see her at the hotel after the supper service was done, when Mrs. Garfield let her sit on the back steps with a cup of coffee. She looked at me coming down the alley and she went still, not afraid, just watchful, that jaw set. I sat on the bottom step below her. I told her what Ames had found. She listened. When I was done, she looked at her coffee cup for a while. She said, "The man I shot had it coming." I waited. She said, "My husband, former husband, he'd been coming for me for 2 years after I left. Gila Bend was the 3rd time he found me." She paused. "I didn't kill him. Wish I had, but I didn't. He's alive and healing and telling anyone who'll listen that I tried to murder him." I said, "Was there anyone who'd say different?" She said, 2 women who were there who are too scared of him to say anything to anyone ever, and a bartender who told me privately he'd back me up, but privately doesn't do much good." I sat with that. She said, "If you have to take me in, I understand it." She said it flat, not resigned, not pleading, like it was a practical question about what happened next. I said, "What I have to do is write to the marshal's office in Yuma and ask what the actual status of this is, because a newspaper item is not a warrant." She looked at me, that arithmetic again going faster. I said, "In the meantime, you're not going anywhere you weren't planning to go." She said, "I wasn't planning to go anywhere." I said, "All right then." I wrote to Yuma. It took 12 days to get an answer. The answer was that the matter was listed as under investigation. No warrant had been issued, and unless I had specific reason to hold anyone, I could proceed as I saw fit. I read that letter 3 times. I took it to mean what I wanted it to mean, which is maybe not strictly by the book, but the book doesn't always account for what's actually true. I told Ruth. She read the letter herself, folded it, handed it back. She said, "Thank you, Sheriff." I said my name was Cole. She could call me that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right. Cole." It was the first time she'd said my name. I went back to the office and did nothing useful for the rest of the afternoon. Winter came early that year. First snow was the 5th of November, light stuff, nothing that stayed, but the cold arrived behind it and didn't leave. I had the boys home sick the second week of November, a chest thing, both of them at once, the way they always got sick at the same time like they'd agreed on it. I was up 3 nights running. On the second night, Caleb was coughing hard enough that I sat up with him and held him against my chest for 2 hours, just to keep him elevated, and felt that thing you feel when a child of yours is sick. Not quite panic, something worse than panic, something slow and certain that lives just under everything and rises when the lights are out and the child is breathing wrong. He was fine by morning. They both were by Thursday, but by Friday I had it myself. I don't get sick often and I don't handle it well. I'm honest about that. I was behind on 2 weeks of reports for the county. I had a fence dispute on the Harker property that needed arbitrating, and I was flat on my back, unable to get my boots on without the room moving. Ames took the badge for the day. The boys were back at school. I was alone in the house by 9 in the morning, lying on the kitchen floor because the kitchen floor was cooler than the bed, and my head felt like a boot heel. That's where Ruth found me. She'd come by to bring something soup, as it turned out, that Mrs. Garfield had sent over when she heard the boys had been sick, not knowing yet that I was too. She knocked. I'd left the front door unlocked, which I wouldn't have done if I'd been thinking clearly. She knocked again, and then she opened the door and called my name. "Cole," she said, and I heard it from the kitchen floor, and I said I was in the back. She came to the kitchen doorway and looked at me on the floor. She said, "Are you better or worse than you look?" I said I was about the same. She set down the soup pot and crouched down. She put the back of her hand against my forehead, quick and matter-of-fact. Her hand was cool. She kept it there for a second longer than necessary, maybe. She said, "You should be in bed." I said the floor was cooler. She said, "I know, but you should be in bed." She stood up. "Come on." I said I was fine where I was. She said, "Cole." Just my name, but there was something in it, not impatience, not irritation, just a kind of plain certainty, the way you'd say come in out of the rain, like it was obvious and she was just confirming it. I got up off the floor. She steadied me once when I caught the counter, just a hand on my arm, and then I made it to the bedroom, and she had the sense not to help me any further than that, which I was grateful for. I sat on the bed. She went back to the kitchen. I heard her doing something with the soup. She sat with me that afternoon. She didn't have to. She told me later that she'd traded shifts with the other girl at the hotel. She sat in the chair by the window and read, or pretended to, and every so often she'd come over and check on me. At some point I slept. When I woke up she was still there, the book in her lap, watching out the window at the snow that had started coming down. I looked at her for a while before she knew I was awake. She was 40 or thereabouts. There were lines at the corners of her eyes and her mouth from something, not smiling necessarily, just from living. She had her boots crossed at the ankle, those same boots, the stitched ones, and she was turned slightly toward the window, and the light was going gray with the snow, and it came across her in a way that made her look settled. Like she'd been in that chair before. Like she belonged in the room. I said, "Why did you stay in Colton?" She turned from the window. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "I told you on the platform, I might be staying." I said, "That was before you knew about the Yuma business, before any of this." She said, "I know." I said, "Why?" She looked at her boots. She said, "Because your boy said I looked like I was staying. And I was so tired of leaving." She turned her face back toward the window. "And then I met you, and the boys, and I thought, this is a good place. This is a good man." She paused. There's not so many of those, a good man. When you find one, you pay attention. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. She said, go back to sleep, Cole. I did. The boys came home from school to find her in the kitchen. I heard it through the wall, Ellis's voice first, high and immediate, then Caleb's, and then her voice lower, and then the sound of chairs being pulled out. She was feeding them. I lay there listening to my sons eat soup in my kitchen with a woman who had just told me I was a good man, and something happened behind my sternum that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness exactly. Something before happiness, like standing at a door you'd forgotten was there. She wasn't there when I woke up the next morning. The soup pot was clean and put away. There was a cloth folded on the kitchen table, and under it a piece of corn bread she'd left from the hotel and a note that said, "Boys ate well, you should eat. R***." I read that note several times. Then I put it in the drawer with the letters from Caroline. Not because it was the same thing, because it was worth keeping. I was back on my feet by Sunday. By Sunday I was also very clear on the fact that I had a decision to make, and that I had been a coward about it for 8 weeks, and that I was going to stop being a coward, or I was going to spend the rest of my life on the kitchen floor alone. I went to the hotel Monday morning. I asked Mrs. Garfield if Ruth was available. Mrs. Garfield gave me a look that suggested she had strong opinions about this and would share them freely when I was out of earshot, but she went and got Ruth. Ruth came out to the lobby. She was in her work apron. She looked at me. I said, "Would you have supper with me?" She said, "With the boys." I said I was asking her, on her own. I had asked Hilda Marsh to watch the boys. She looked at me for a moment, that arithmetic running. Then she said, "Yes." Simple as that, yes. I want to tell you about that supper, because it wasn't what you'd think. It wasn't practiced. She wasn't performing and I wasn't performing. We sat in the back of the restaurant on Garfield because the front was too loud on a Monday, and we ate roast beef and potatoes, and she told me about where she'd grown up in Nebraska, flat as a table, her father a dry goods man who died when she was 15, and left her mother with 4 kids and a bill of sale nobody would honor. She said she'd learned to handle a horse and do sums before she learned to cook, and the cooking had stayed mediocre ever since. I said the corn bread had been good. She laughed at that, not a polite laugh, a real one, sudden, that she covered with her hand, and then she looked at me through her fingers and said, "Corn bread is the exception." I said, "One exception is enough." She looked at me. The laugh was still somewhere in her face, not quite gone. I said, "I want to be direct with you about something." She nodded. I said, "I've been alone a long time. I'm not practiced at this. Whatever this is, I don't want to make it into something it isn't, but I also don't want to be a coward and watch you walk away from Colton because I was afraid to say something." She said, "What did you want to say?" I said that I think about you considerably more than I've admitted to anyone, including myself, and that the boys were right. She looked at me. I said on the platform they were right. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the candle on the table. She said, "You know my history, it's not simple." I said I knew. I said mine wasn't either. She said, "I'm not looking to be taken care of." I said I hadn't noticed her needing it. She said, "Good. Because I'll take care of myself and I'll take care of those boys and I'll take care of you when you're flat on the kitchen floor, but I won't be kept." I said, "Ruth, I'm a county sheriff on a county salary. The best I can offer is a house that's paid for and boys who already think they've decided." She pressed her lips together, but it wasn't to hold anything back. It was more like she was holding something down, keeping it from doing something she wasn't ready for. She said, "The boys really say that, decided." I said Ellis had referred to her as a settled fact on 3 separate occasions. She laughed again, slower this time with her whole face, and she looked at the candle and then at me, and the lamp at the table between us was throwing a warm light across her, and she said, "All right, Cole." I said, "All right." She said, "All right. I want to tell you about the moment I knew it was real. Not the supper was the beginning of the real, not the thing itself." It was a Saturday in December, 2 weeks after. There'd been a hard snow on Friday night and the town was white, and the light was that low particular winter light that makes everything smaller and quieter. I was splitting wood in the back. The boys were inside doing something that involved periodic thuds and raised voices, which meant they were fine. Ruth was on the back porch. She'd come by to walk with us to the market. She was in her coat and her fixed boots, and she had her arms crossed against the cold, watching me work. I'd been splitting wood for 15 minutes maybe, and I hadn't been paying her much mind because I was thinking about the fence dispute on the Harker property that I'd finally had to make a ruling on, and whether I'd done it right, and Harker was the type to carry a grudge. I finished a log and stood up, and she was still just standing there, watching. I said, "What?" She said, "Nothing, I'm watching." I said, "You've been watching for 10 minutes. She said, "I know." I looked at her. She wasn't watching me the way you watch someone do a task. She was watching me the way you watch something that belongs to you, not like property, nothing like that, but like something yours, something you've decided about and are sure of. She said, "You're good at that." I said it was splitting wood. She said, "I know what it is." She uncrossed her arms, came down the 2 porch steps, walked over. She took the axe from my hand, which I hadn't expected, and she set it head down in the snow, and she looked up at me and said, "I want to say something." I waited. She said, "I've been careful my whole life. Careful who I trusted, careful what I said, careful about everything because careful was how I stayed safe. And I'm tired of it. I'm tired of it." She paused. "You're a good man, Cole. You are steady and you are decent and you are true. And you've been walking around like you're not worth much since your wife died, and I want you to stop." I said, "Ruth." She said, "I'm not done." Her jaw was set, her eyes direct. "You are worth something. You are worth a considerable amount. Those boys know it. Mrs. Garfield knows it. Ames knows it. Every person in this town who isn't a fool knows it. And I know it." She held my gaze. "So stop acting like the best thing about you left when she did. You're still here. I see you." The cold was sitting heavy on my shoulders, and there were wood chips in the snow, and somewhere inside the house Caleb had just yelled something at Ellis. And I stood there in my yard looking at this woman who'd come from nowhere and decided to stay, and meant every word she just said. I said, "You see me?" She said, "Yes." I said, "What do you see?" She said, "A man worth standing next to." I put my hand against her face, just the side of her jaw, just for a second, and she turned into it slightly. Not much, just enough. Her cheek was cold and her eyes were steady, and she was looking at me like I was a settled fact, which was what my sons had been calling her since October. I said, "I want you to stay." She said, "I know," and then quiet almost to herself, "That's why I came off the train. There are things I can say about after that, and things I'll keep." The Yuma business resolved itself the following spring. The bartender found his courage and gave a statement, and whatever threat her former husband had made about coming to find her got quieter after I sent a letter to the sheriff in Gila Bend with my name and my county on it, and a specific description of what would happen if that man came anywhere near Colton. I won't say more than that. The boys were insufferable about the whole thing. Ellis told everyone at school. Caleb gave Ruth a drawing he'd made of what he apparently considered our family, which he presented to her in the kitchen one Saturday morning, with the seriousness of a man delivering a deed. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and then she folded it very carefully and put it in her apron pocket. She married me on a Thursday in March. We did it at the courthouse because neither of us wanted a production. Ames stood up with me. Mrs. Garfield stood up with her. The boys were there in their good shirts, which I had ironed badly enough that Ruth had done them over without comment while I was getting the horses ready. After the justice was done, we walked back to the house and Ruth made a proper dinner, roast chicken, which she'd been practicing, and Caleb declared it edible, which was apparently the highest praise he had available. And she laughed that laugh, the real one, and it filled the room. That's most of what happened. What I want to say, sitting here with it all behind me now, is this. I had stopped expecting anything for myself. I want to be clear about that, not wallowing in it, not asking you to feel sorry for me, just stating it flat. I'd had good things and lost them, and I had determined that my purpose was the boys and the badge and getting through each day, and that was enough, that was fine, that was what a man in my position did. Then a woman came off a train with stitched boots and gray eyes and no plan to be taken care of, and she watched me split wood and told me I was worth standing next to, and she stayed. I think about Ellis on that platform, 7 years old, pointing with both arms, saying that's our new mama asterisk. I used to think it was just a thing children say, picking up on something they couldn't name. Now I think he saw her face when she came off that train, that look she had, tired of leaving, tired of running, and he recognized something. A person who decided to stop. A person who was ready. I think maybe I was ready too. I just needed someone to see it first. She still wears the same boots. She got new ones in April and wore them twice and went back to the old ones, stitched wire and all. I asked her why. She said, these ones know where they're going. I didn't argue. That's my wife.